Aden stood me up again because of the transfer student. When I found him, Aden was chuckling in front of a group of his buddies. What right does she have to control me? He thought I would quarrel with him as before, clutching the test papers and pestering him over one or two wrong questions. But this time, I didn't say a word. He forgot our promise to go to the same university and the bet to compete for the first place in the grade. Instead, he was having a great time with the transfer student every day. I buried myself in doing the test questions again and again. On the day when the college entrance examination results came out, he showed up downstairs at my house with red eyes. If I repeat a year of study, will you still be able to control me? I looked at his pitiful scores and shook my head. You're joking. What right do I have to control you? On the day when the monthly exam results came out, Aden was gone again. I stared at the test papers and waited in the classroom until it got dark. In the corridor outside, I heard the classmates' discussions. Why is she still waiting? Didn't Aden go to play billiards with the transfer student long ago? How pitiful. She's been stood up again. I was stunned for a moment. I couldn't count how many times this had happened. Since Luna transferred to our school, Aden had never been on time for our appointments. By the time I found him, it was already pitch dark. Aden was sitting on the steps talking to Luna about something, and the buddies around were laughing merrily. Luna tilted her head and caught sight of me but didn't say anything. Instead, she turned to ask Aden, "You skipped classes with me. Aren't you afraid that Hayes will give you trouble?" As soon as these words came out, the buddies around laughed even louder. While laughing, they imitated my words. "Can you be a bit more serious, Aden? How could you even get this kind of question wrong?" Aden interrupted their imitation, and his tone was extremely casual. "So what if I skipped classes? What right does she have to control me?" The wind at night was particularly chilly. I froze on the spot. Suddenly, I felt that I had been like a joke during this period. Luna was amused by these words. She was already good-looking, and when she smiled, she was especially eye-catching. Aden tilted his head to look at her, was stunned for 2 seconds, and then also pulled the corners of his mouth. The next moment, he turned his head and unexpectedly met my gaze. The street lamp was dim, but I clearly saw Aden's smile disappear. The impatience in his eyes was not concealed at all. "Why are you here?" He probably thought that I would quarrel with him as before. So before I could say anything, he first looked away and said coldly, "I'm just indulging myself once in a while. There's nothing wrong with that, right?" Luna chimed in beside him. "It's so boring to bury yourself in books every day." But this time, I didn't say a word. After looking at Aden quietly for 2 seconds, I turned around and left without hesitation. Those buddies exclaimed, "Hey! It's strange. Hayes didn't lecture you this time." Aden's faint voice came from behind. He said, "Yeah. Thank goodness for that. I came to school especially early the next day. No matter how many conflicts we had in the past, I always dragged Aden to get up early and go to school. At that time, Aden always had a messy head of hair. When he opened the door, he would apologize. 'Missy, I overslept again. Wait for me for 2 minutes.' When he opened the door again, his hair was still messy, and he casually handed me a bottle of hot milk. 'I had time to heat the milk but no time to fix your messy hair.' Huh?" Aden casually ruffled his hair a couple of times. "Are you touched?" Then remember a few more English words later. Aden and I had agreed to go to the same university. For us who were in the middle of the class in terms of grades, it wasn't an easy thing. But every monthly exam, our grades could always improve a bit. After the monthly exams, it was the tacit review time. Every wrong question was taken out and studied repeatedly. After Luna transferred to our school, Aden gradually began to forget our agreement. He hung out with Luna, skipped classes, and left early. He was no longer the Aden I knew. There weren't many people in the class in the early morning. Most of them were those who came early for morning reading. However, I saw Luna, who had arrived early, beside Aden's desk. She was holding a steaming hot breakfast in her hand, and casually put it on Aden's desk. When she saw me, she subconsciously looked back. In the past, Aden and I always came to school together. Not seeing Aden, Luna suddenly laughed. Here. This is the breakfast I promised as a result of losing a bet. Please tell him for me that I didn't break my promise. Luna wasn't in our class. But nobody didn't know about her transfer. Because on the day she transferred, she found Aden in front of everyone. Excuse me, classmate. Do you still remember me? Aden frowned as he looked at her. Should I remember? Yeah, had in facile session. I gave you an umbrella on a rainy day. Have you forgotten? I don't remember. Think again? Aden still couldn't recall it. That's right that you don't remember. Luna smiled with her eyes curved like she had succeeded in playing a trick. Her eyes were bright and full of playfulness. Because I was just making it up. Here. The teacher asked me to bring you the test papers. I'm Luna from the neighboring class. Do you remember me now? Aden took the test papers. He leaned on the desk and stared at Luna. And was amused. Okay. Got it. Luna tapped on the desk. Interrupting my memories. Please do me a favor. I came back to my senses and didn't even look up. I won't get involved in your affairs. Huh? Are you angry because of what was said yesterday? Luna pouted. Aden wasn't wrong either. What identity do you have to control whether he studies or not? Yeah. I nodded. So I won't care about it anymore in the future. TSK. Luna rolled her eyes in boredom. How ridiculous. After the monthly exams, we would change seats according to our grades. Once the seating chart came out, the class was in an uproar. I looked up and saw that my seat was even closer to the front than last time. But Aden's name was arranged in the back row. In the past, even if his ranking dropped by just one place, it would be enough to make Aden gloomy for a whole day. Now he seemed not to care at all. Since he didn't care, I cared even less. Just as I was walking forward with my books in my arms, my eyes met Aden's. Probably thinking that I had come to find him on purpose. Aden subconsciously took a step back, and his gaze at me was tinged with a bit of annoyance. I didn't know when Aden had become like this. Don't look at me like that. I looked up at him quietly. Your grades in the future have nothing to do with me. Aden froze on the spot. Really? A few seconds later, he came back to his senses. Let out a sigh of relief. And also forced a smile. That's the best. I walked away with my books in my arms without looking back. In the next monthly exam, I ranked among the top 100 in the grade. But Aden's grades, however, dropped again and again. But he still didn't care and instead had a great time with Luna. The buddies beside Aden had said more than once that Luna was different from me. She was full of youthful vitality and was much more interesting. She couldn't be compared with someone like me who only cared about grades. At that time, I asked Aden, do you think so too? Aden just softly recited Luna's name. He didn't say a word. Now looking back, it turned out that Aden had given the answer from the very beginning. The weather was getting colder and colder, while the relationship between Aden and Luna was getting closer and closer. Every evening self-study session, when I was burying my head in doing the test questions, Luna would appear by the window and wave to Aden. Sometimes she would bring candied cakes, or hot milk, or a snowman that she had just made. Aden's desk was filled with the little things that Luna gave him. The teacher had talked to Aden several times. At the door of the office, the teacher's voice full of disappointment could be heard. Didn't you and Hayes agree to make progress together and compete for the first place in the grade before? Look at Hayes's current grades. She's far ahead of you. Do you know that? I heard that you two had an agreement to go to the same university. With your current scores, do you think you can be admitted? Aren't you the least bit worried? Now I had climbed into the top 3 in the class, while Aden was still staying where he was. When he came out of the office, he happened to run into me who was going to see the teacher. Aden's gaze lingered on me for 2 seconds. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something. But in the end, he didn't say anything. In my best performance, I ranked among the top 10 in the grade and was the first in the class. When I was being praised by the head teacher on the podium, Aden was staring at the report card in a daze in the audience. I heard that his grades hit a new low this time. In the past, he would always be named and criticized by the head teacher. But this time, the head teacher probably didn't even bother to mention his name. That evening self-study session. It was rare that Aiden wasn't called out by Luna. He just sat silently in his seat, staring at the report card without saying a word. I didn't know what he was feeling now. All I knew was that I was getting closer and closer to my goal. When I walked out of the classroom, I realized that the snow outside was falling heavily. The snow falling on my hand was icy cold, but my heart was boiling with excitement. At that moment, I realized that there was nothing more delightful than making progress. In a trance, I remembered an agreement I had with Aiden a long time ago. Whoever ranked among the top 10 in the grade would buy a cake together to celebrate on that day. Now, whether we got together or not didn't matter. Whether Aiden was by my side or not didn't matter. What mattered was that I was among the top 10 in the grade. What mattered was that I was going to buy a cake and eat it tonight. I thought carefully in the snow for a long time about whether to buy a strawberry cake or a mango cake after school. When I returned to the classroom, I found that Luna had come in at some point. She was standing beside Aiden, snatched the report card, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it aside. Don't look at it. Why should such lousy scores affect your mood? We can still make it in time even if we leave at the last minute. Some people have been studying hard for so long, but still haven't managed to get the first place in the grade. I think it doesn't make a difference whether you study or not. As soon as these words were said, some people in the class couldn't bear it. Easier said than done. Are your grades even half as high as hers? It's so funny these days. Anyone can come and mock the first in the class. Luna was so choked that her face turned red, and she rolled her eyes twice in a row. Were you talking about me? Then she immediately turned around and nudged Aiden. Are you going to the internet cafe later? I found something really interesting. It's so much fun. Let's go together. Aiden didn't say anything. Luna pushed him again in dissatisfaction. Are you going or not? Everyone else is going. Oh, come on. Let's go. Aiden unfolded the crumpled report card. I'm not going. He said. I have something to do tonight. The snow hadn't stopped when school was over. On the way to the cake shop, the sound of stepping on the snow was especially pleasant to the ear. However, I didn't expect to see Aiden at the entrance of this cake shop. He had probably been waiting here for a while. There was a thin layer of snow on his shoulders. He was also holding a cake in his hand. When he saw me, he hesitated for a few seconds. Then he handed the cake to me. The cake was simple, with a few strawberries on it and some crooked words. Before I could see clearly what was written, Aiden had already put the cake in my hands. He looked up at me, with complicated emotions in his eyes. This is your cake, Hayes. Congratulations. Top 10 in the grade. What do you mean? I shook the cake in my hand and looked up at him. The promised cake, Aiden's voice was a bit hoarse. I didn't expect you could make such rapid progress. Hayes. Well done. Of course. I did well. During all the days and nights of this period, none of my efforts were in vain. I nodded approvingly. Didn't you teach me that where there's a will, there's a way? I wasn't a patient person before. It's undeniable that the former Aiden really taught me a lot. Aiden also gave a chuckle and said, yeah. He looked down at the cake. I struggled between strawberry and mango for a while, and finally chose strawberry. Although I had been like a stranger to Aiden during this period, his words still made me daze for a moment. The former Aiden liked to come close to me and ask whether I wanted strawberry or mango cake. This question used to make me struggle for a whole day every time. If you hadn't insisted on hanging out with Luna and her gang, your grades would be almost as good as mine now. Aiden frowned slightly. It has nothing to do with Luna. Besides, grades don't represent everything. Aiden's subconsciously partial tone made me stunned for a second. I nodded and said, you're right. It has nothing to do with her. You've only got yourself to blame. Aiden's face turned pale. The snow was gradually getting heavier. I took a deep breath. You can keep this cake and eat it yourself. I bought one for myself. I reached out to hand the cake over. However, somehow when I let go, Aiden didn't catch it. I watched helplessly as the cake fell to the ground and shattered into pieces. The already crooked words on it became even more slanted. I could vaguely see a few words of blessing which were mixed with the cream and gradually became blurred. Aden's hand that was supposed to catch the cake froze in my drawer. I was just about to speak when I was suddenly interrupted by a voice coming from beside me. All right. All right. The cake has been delivered. What are you still waiting for? This voice. I looked up and sure enough, it was Luna. As soon as she appeared, she put her arm on Aden's shoulder and looked at the cake on the ground with schadenfreude. I've said it long ago. Hayes is such a good student. Now, how can we be worthy at talking to the top student in the grade? What a pity for this cake. It really can't be eaten like this. Aden stared at the shattered cake on the ground with his eyes downcast and didn't say a word. I didn't expect Luna to show up here. She turned her head to look at me and then at Aden. Eh? No way. Haven't you mentioned the birthday yet? What birthday? I subconsciously looked at Aden. Aden didn't show any surprised expression on his face at Luna's appearance. He just stared at the cake on the ground for 2 seconds and then looked up at me. Actually, I came to see you for another thing. I'll be busy on your birthday next month. So I may not be able to make it. Next month? Birthday? I was in a daze for a moment before I realized that my birthday was coming soon. It was the birthday that Aden had promised to accompany me on. On the night when my mother passed away, Aden rushed over in the rain and made a promise. At that time, he was at a loss and kept comforting and assuring me. He said that he wouldn't leave me, Hayes, alone. The agreement made by my aunt wouldn't fall through. He would accompany me no matter what happened. Only on my birthday. He wouldn't be absent. Even though my mother was gone, he would still celebrate it for me. The being busy that Aden mentioned. Actually, I had also heard about it. Next month, there was a skateboarding competition that Luna would participate in. And Aden had promised to accompany her. After Aden finished speaking, Luna dragged him forward. At the moment when he turned around, I couldn't help but laugh. I was too naive. I really thought that Aden had remembered the agreement and came to deliver this cake. There was even a moment. I thought I saw the shadow of the former Aden. It turned out that he just came with Luna to show off in front of me. To display their ambiguous relationship in front of me. Just to tell me clearly that he was going to break his promise. For Luna's sake. Luna turned her hand and asked inexplicably, "What are you laughing at?" I ignored her and looked up at Aden. The snow was getting heavier again. But my heart was unprecedentedly calm and peaceful. Aden, again. I overestimated you. However, even if you hadn't come to tell me tonight, I wouldn't have taken it to heart. You've broken your promises quite a few times. We are people on to different paths. We can't walk together from the beginning. I picked up the cake on the ground and threw it into the trash can. Everything we said before is completely invalidated tonight. I just hope you won't regret your current choice. Luna laughed speechlessly. TSK. TSK. The top student really speaks in an educated way. What's there to regret or not? What does a bookworm know? She raised her head and turned around in the snow. Thin snowflakes fell on her hair. She sighed. High school life should be diverse. Does one have to have good grades to be right? Aden didn't turn his head back. He stared at Luna in the snow and said firmly. No. After that snowy night, there was a long period of sunny days. The countdown to the college entrance examination began. My grades remained stable in the top 3 of the grade. Aden and Luna skipped classes more frequently. They smoked and played cards. They did all kinds of free and casual things. Even at a certain moment, I saw the same style of couple bracelets on their wrists. When he saw me, Aden subconsciously hid his hands behind his back. I didn't have any waves in my heart. I withdrew my gaze, lowered my head, and continued to work on the practice questions. Finally, heading so fell wide say. One day, news came out. Aden and Luna's relationship was discovered. And their parents were called to school. When Luna came out of the office, her eyes were red from crying. Aden stood at the door of the office, facing his father. Aden's father didn't say anything that day. He held the report card as if he had suddenly become a lot more haggard. Aden froze in place as if he had been suddenly dragged from the illusory world back to reality. He didn't look up at his father. Nor did he look at Luna. He just stared at the name of Hayes, the top student on the report card. And his eyes suddenly turned red. Subsequently, Aiden didn't come to school for a whole week. This passionate and youthful relationship gradually faded away under the oppressive atmosphere of Senior 3. Nearly 10 days before the college entrance examination, Aiden's father called me to his home. In front of Aiden, he put the gift that had been agreed to belong to the top student in the grade into my hands. Aiden's father said that after hearing about the bet, he had always prepared to gifts. Now, Aiden's gift had no chance to be taken out. Aiden was stunned on the spot. Aiden's father lit a cigarette and turned to ask Aiden, "Do you regret it? For this so-called free, unrestrained, and reckless youth? Your current grades are not even half of Hayes's. Do you still remember how you discussed with Hayes about applying to the same university?" Aiden lowered his head, clenching his fists tightly. When he looked up again, his eyes met mine. When we passed by each other, Aiden suddenly called out to me, "Hayes." I didn't turn back. Nor did I stop. It rained heavily during the college entrance examination. The sound of the pen rubbing against the test paper mixed with the sound of the rain outside the window, playing the final tune for the efforts of these 3 years. On the day when the results came out, I looked at my excellent grades that exceeded my normal performance and let out a long sigh of relief as I lay on the bed. The voices of the elders' conversations came from the living room. I vaguely heard the voice of Aiden's father. When Aiden was mentioned, the living room suddenly became quiet for a moment. I heard that Aiden's grades were hardly enough to get into an undergraduate program. After the silence, there were sighs. Some people said that if Aiden had studied hard at the beginning, he could also have been admitted to a good school. Others said that it would have been nice if someone could have persuaded Aiden at that time. I lay on the bed quietly looking at the ceiling in a daze. I vaguely remembered the scene when I went to find Aiden in the evening. Aiden's friend exclaimed, "Hey! It's really strange. Hayes didn't even lecture you today." What did Aiden say at that time? It seemed that he said, "Yeah. Thank goodness for that." I turned over and heard the rain falling outside the window again. Aiden, who had said that he wouldn't regret it before, called me on the first day when the results came out. The sound of the rain was ticking in the phone. Aiden's voice was very soft. He asked me, "Hayes, can we meet? I'm downstairs." The rain was pouring down. Aiden didn't even hold an umbrella. The loose short-sleeved shirt that he usually wore was soaked and clung tightly to his body, making him look extremely embarrassed. When he saw me, he still forced a smile at the corner of his mouth and smiled a bit uncomfortably. "Hayes, I've heard that you got excellent grades. Congratulations." I nodded. "Yeah. I deserve it." Aiden's eyesight dimmed instantly, and his voice became much softer. Then, "Which school are you planning to apply to?" I casually said, "Probably a school that you can't apply to with your grades. I heard that the sum of your grades and Luna's is not even as high as mine." Probably this sentence stung Aiden. Aiden's face stiffened. "Do you have to say it like this?" I stood on the steps looking down at him without saying a word. After 2 seconds of silence, he said again, "There won't be Luna anymore. Don't tell me these things. They have nothing to do with me." I was really too lazy to listen. When I turned around to leave, I was suddenly grabbed by the wrist. Aiden's face turned pale because of my words. The rainwater slid down his cheeks. He stared at me motionlessly, and the sadness in his eyes seemed to overflow. "Is it because of the past things?" Aiden's voice suddenly became hoarse. "I'm sorry, Hayes. I was too ridiculous before. I wasted all the time that should have been used for studying. During this period, I thought every day, if I had listened to you at the beginning, maybe now we could apply to the same university. Just like what we said before." I yawned and impatiently interrupted his words. "I'm so sleepy. Just get to the point." Aiden lowered his eyes, and his fingers grasping mine tight and continuously. "Does the promise we made before about applying to the same university still count? If I repeat a year of study?" Aiden paused when he said this. He looked up at me with a bit more expectation in his eyes. "Can you still take care of me?" I smiled and looked at him for 2 seconds, then raised my hand to slowly break his fingers apart. "Just kidding. Aiden, what right do I have to take care of you?" On the day of filling out the college application forms, the class group was bustling. Everyone was excitedly discussing which school to apply to. Messages were popping up one after another. I heard that Hayes has broken the school's highest grade record in the past 3 years this time. She really did an excellent job. I'm so envious. If I had her grades, I would fill out the application forms without even thinking. Forget it. With the way Hayes studies so hard, who can keep up with her? To be honest, if Aiden hadn't fallen in love early, he might have been almost as good as her. I remember that their grades were rising rapidly at that time. Once this topic came up, the group chat became even more lively. Probably because we graduated. Everyone spoke more freely. Aiden was so obsessed with that transfer student at that time that he didn't have time to study. Yeah. I remember that he stood Hayes up several times, and even allowed Luna to be sarcastic in front of Hayes. I also remember that Luna once said that even with so much effort, you still didn't get the first place in the grade. Now you must be sweating buckets. Now she has no time to care about these things. With her scores, she won't even have time to cry. Aiden never said a word in the group chat. Those buddies who used to be close to Aiden also fell unusually silent today. Luna did break up with Aiden. The two of them, who once caused a big stir, also separated with the graduation season. Passion and novelty will fade away. But the achievements gained through hard work will remain. I closed the group chat and chose the school I had been longing for. Lying on the sofa, when I thought about it carefully, there was nothing that made me feel regretful during these 3 years. When I came back to my senses, I found that the group chat exploded again because of a message from Aiden. Aiden said that he was going to repeat a year of study. He wanted to go to the same school as I did, to fulfill the promise that hadn't been fulfilled back then. There was a strange silence in the group for a while. Then came a series of copied and pasted secs that filled the screen. Someone me, I love Ahu Yan. Let's interview our grade's first place student. What's your thought now? I didn't say anything. I also casually copied and pasted a secs. On the day when the admission notice arrived, the sun was extraordinarily bright. I took the notice and a bouquet of flowers and went to the cemetery to visit my mother. On the night when I made an agreement with Aiden to go to the same university, she patted her legs and said that our ancestors must be smiling down on us from heaven. She cooked a lot of dishes that day with great fanfare. I put down the flowers and shook the notice in my hand. First place in the grade. Now our ancestors must really be smiling down on us. But it was really hard to get this first place in the grade. I almost ground my teeth to pieces. I had been fulfilling all the expectations she had before. The only difference was that Aiden and I separated halfway. I stood beside the tomb and said a lot of words. All the words that had been pent up in my heart these days poured out. When I first parted ways with Aiden, it would be a lie to say that I wasn't sad. But everyone has their own path to follow. It was just that on my birthday, I bought 3 cakes at once. I ate them at home alone while crying. It was also at that moment that I thought I would never forgive Aiden. After saying what was on my mind, I felt much more comfortable. I suddenly turned around and saw Aiden, who had come at some point. He stood there. I didn't know how much of what I had just said he had heard. But I have a habit. Things that I care about will always be kept in my heart. Once I say them out loud, it means that I really won't care about them anymore. Aiden probably knew that too. His Adam's apple bobbed, and when he spoke, his voice was a bit hoarse. You weren't at home. I guessed that you would come here. I'm sorry about your birthday. I broke my promise. I've decided to repeat a year of study. I'm going to apply for the same university as you. Hayes. Can we go back to how we were before? Aiden's tone was extremely humble. I smiled at him. Whether you repeat a year of study or not is your choice. Just like back then. I have no right to control you. Aiden didn't take my words to heart. He seemed to have gone back to how he was before. He would eat a bottle of milk for me in the morning and buy a small cake when passing by a cake shop. Although I didn't accept these things, he still kept doing them. It seemed that by being so persistent, he could go back to the past. Sometimes, I really couldn't figure Aiden out. When he liked Luna, he would rather neglect his studies to be with her. But after they broke up, he could let go quickly. But perhaps it's really like what they said. The love and excitement in adolescence are carefree. They come on strongly. And they also fade away quickly. The two of them gradually lost contact with each other as they graduated. But all of these had nothing to do with me. That evening, Aden came to find me as usual. He was really determined to repeat a year of study and go to the same university as I did. He said that he had definitely made mistakes back then. Mistakes made on impulse should also have a chance to be made up for. I looked up at the sunlight and asked him, "Do you still remember what you said to me when I went to find you that night?" "Aden, Laiden. You may really think that you've made mistakes. But there's one thing you really didn't say wrong. I have no right to interfere in anyone's business. Whether you repeat a year of study or not has nothing to do with me. That's your choice. Once you make a choice, you have to bear the consequences." Perhaps my tone was too calm. Aden's face became paler and paler. He probably really realized that I wasn't joking with him. Instead, I had really and completely drawn a clear line with him. That evening, Aden, who had always been carefree, had red eyes in front of me. He begged me in a low voice not to talk to him like that. I just shook my head. Just like what he had said to me before. I replied, "You have no right to control my attitude." I heard that Aden froze on the spot and stood there for a long time. The long-awaited college life wasn't as easy as I had imagined. Scholarships, competitions. Each of these things kept me busy to the point of exhaustion. In a rare break, I heard that Aden really went back to repeat a year of study. But his grades didn't improve significantly. With his grades after repeating a year of study, he barely managed to get into a fairly decent undergraduate program. I heard that the university he applied for was in the same city as mine. The distance wasn't very far. Every time I went home, I always heard the neighbors' sighs of pity for Aden. If he hadn't fallen in love early in high school and had studied hard instead, maybe he would have had a bright future. Maybe the college entrance examination isn't the only way out. But for ordinary people, the college entrance examination is an important turning point. And Aden stumbled here. In the past, people always subconsciously associated me with Aden. But as time passed, Aden and I gradually went our separate ways. Before the New Year's Eve, I attended a long-awaited class reunion. In a few years, everyone had changed quite a bit. At the reunion, many people were joking and calling me grade's first-place student, one after another. Aden was sitting in the corner. He raised his head and looked over from a distance. There seemed to be too many emotions in his eyes. But he didn't say anything. He just pursed his lips and smiled at me. After the reunion ended, it had started to snow outside. I stood at the door and looked up. The cold snowflakes fell on my face, dissipating a lot of the heat. When I opened my eyes again, I unexpectedly met Aden's gaze. He was standing in front of me with an umbrella and said softly, "Be careful not to catch a cold." That one sentence suddenly brought me back to the past. In the past, I always loved to run around wildly in the snow, but every time after that, I would have to drink medicine while pinching my nose when I went back. So every time Aden would always chase after me with an umbrella in his hand, shouting as he chased, "Missy, please, could you just use an umbrella?" I took a step back to keep a distance, took out my umbrella from my bag, and said with a smile, "I brought one too." Aden was stunned. There was a moment of surprise on his face before he gradually withdrew the hand holding the umbrella. I opened my umbrella and walked back with Aden side by side. There was a not too long and not too short distance between us. Aden was silent for 2 seconds before asking me, "How have you been lately?" "I've been fine all along." Aden was silent for another 2 seconds. I still broke my promise. "I didn't get into the same university as you." "Yeah." I nodded and commented, "You're kind of a disappointment." Aden didn't refute. The way home wasn't long. But Aden walked very slowly. He asked me about my recent situation from time to time. When it came to himself, he looked down and laughed at himself. Actually, I had also heard about these things in recent years. Aden was about to graduate. And it was hard to find a job in his university. His future was uncertain. He didn't seem to have gotten over what happened back then. Aden stood there. After a long silence, he suddenly asked me, if I hadn't chosen Luna back then, Would things have been different for us? I looked at him silently and gave a silent answer. In the end, Aden let out a long sigh. He closed his umbrella and looked up at the sky. Boundless snowflakes fell on him. His voice was a bit repressed, and he murmured softly, "If only I had listened to you back then. But there are no ifs in the world. The wrong path chosen on impulse back then would take a long time to make up for. Later, I gradually didn't run into Aden anymore. In a certain convenience store, I saw a familiar face. When she saw me, she froze on the spot. After coming back to her senses, she subconsciously turned her head away. But I still recognized her at a glance. That side face belonged to Luna, who used to be extremely carefree. In a few years, it seemed that she had suddenly lost the glow of youth and was battered by society. Luna failed the college entrance examination in her senior year of high school. She didn't choose to repeat a year of study and didn't even continue her studies. She found a job casually. Over the years she had changed jobs many times. For those of us born in ordinary families, there aren't too many opportunities to turn our lives around. I was stunned for a moment and felt a bit dazed. For a while I couldn't connect the person in front of me with the Luna who said high school life should be so colorful on that snowy night. I still can't answer her question back then. Is it really right to only focus on good grades? Now there was no longer that carefree smile on Luna's face. Perhaps high school life was indeed colorful. But that was all under the condition of fulfilling the main tasks. Anything else, no matter how exciting it was just an insignificant side task beside the main task. We exchanged glances and our gazes met in the air for a moment. Neither of us said a word. After leaving the store I wrapped my windbreaker around me tightly and turned to walk forward. The morning sun in front of me was bright and dazzling. During the 3 years of high school I worked as hard as I could. Now my life has just begun. I still have a lot of future to explore. I think I will keep making progress until the last moment. Extra story: after Aden repeated a year of study, his grades didn't improve by leaps and bounds as expected. He always felt the shadow of Hayes in this school. Even during class he was always absent in it. He would be lost in thought, thinking about the surprised look on Hayes's face when he stood her up back then. He didn't think it was a big deal at that time, but when he recalled it, that expression was so clear and couldn't be erased from his mind. Aden felt that he had done an extremely absurd and wrong thing. So absurd that every time he thought about it, his heart ached terribly. He wanted to make up for it, to salvage the situation. But he was at a loss and didn't know what to do. Hayes was no longer the person who could be coaxed back with just a cake as she was in the past. After the college entrance examination, when filling out the application forms, Aden applied for the same city as Hayes. Subconsciously, he wanted to be a bit closer to her. He even had the illusion that they could go back to what they used to be. Aden went to look for Hayes at school several times. The calmer and more indifferent Hayes was, the tighter the knot in Aden's heart became. Hayes always told him that she had almost forgotten about the past. But Aden just couldn't let it go. Hayes was so outstanding. She was constantly moving forward. Undoubtedly, a person like her would attract the admiration of boys. When Aden went to find Hayes, he happened to see Hayes with a boy from the same school. Aden froze on the spot instantly. He could clearly sense that the boy looked at Hayes with a different look in his eyes. But now, he didn't even have the right to get close. Aden stood there in a daze, quietly watching the two of them walking away gradually. He was always thinking that if he hadn't broken his promise back then, the one standing in front of Hayes like this now would be himself. It's a pity that, just as Hayes said, there are no ifs in this world. Once something is wrong, it's wrong. One has to take responsibility for one's mistakes. Sometimes when he thought about it carefully, he couldn't even remember what Luna looked like. The impulse and the sense of novelty that he had in the heat of the moment back then seemed to have completely disappeared. On the contrary, on countless nights, Aden dreamed of Hayes, dreamed of going back to the past, dreamed of the time when Luna had just transferred to this school. This time, he didn't hesitate and chose Hayes. There were no broken promises, nor any sarcastic remarks. He and Hayes were together, competing for the first place in the grade as they did in the past, but every time when he wanted to say something to Hayes, the dream would always be interrupted suddenly. Aden opened his eyes abruptly. The sound of his heartbeat was infinitely amplified in the silence. Aden sat up, stared at the darkness in front of him, and fell into a long silence. Extra story to Aden got up late again. There was a knock on the door. He didn't even have time to comb his hair and rushed to the kitchen to heat up the milk first. Hayes had the habit of drinking milk every morning. By the time he finished washing up, the milk was already heated. Aden opened the door and walked out with his messy hair. Hayes was leaning against the wall. Before she could say anything, a bottle of milk was stuffed into her hand. At the beginning, Hayes would take a bottle of milk to drink on the way every day. But her stomach was really not good, and she was too lazy to heat the milk. So Aden silently took this task upon himself. The wind in the early morning was very refreshing. Aden looked down at Hayes. Hayes, how about we make a bet? Hayes looked up, drinking the milk, and asked vaguely. What? The first place in the grade. Hayes was so shocked that she spat out a mouthful of milk. Do you know what you're talking about? Yes. Aden suddenly bent down and stared at Hayes with an unprecedented seriousness in his eyes. I also want to go to the school you want to go to with you. Hayes. Let's work hard together. Hayes's eyes were shining brightly. That's what you said. Don't play tricks then. Yeah. Aden nodded. Whoever plays tricks will be a puppy. If you get into the top 10 in the grade, I'll reward you with a cake. Hayes drank up the hot milk in one go. She picked up her school bag. Then I have to think carefully about whether to choose strawberry or mango. Aden walked slowly behind her and was amused by Hayes's hesitant look. Missy, you haven't even improved your grades yet, and you're already thinking about it? Hayes angrily turned back. How dare you? Do you dare to question Missy? How dare I? Aden smiled with his eyes curved. But if Missy dawdle less like this, we'll be late again today. Hayes glanced at her watch and suddenly shouted. She grabbed Aden's wrist and rushed forward crazily. The wind on the road blew their clothes. Aden let her pull him and ran towards the school all the way. But in the next second, Hayes's figure suddenly disappeared in front of his eyes. Aden was left alone, stunned on the spot. His hand frozen mid-air. He didn't come back to his senses for a long time. The end.